All right, welcome everyone to this session of the Plan II Thesis Symposium. This session is titled Diasporic Experiences. This is, of course, the capstone of the Plan II undergraduate honors degree. It's a year-long project that these students have undertaken. And in many ways, it's meant to reflect sort of the constellation of coursework that the students have completed over the course of their 4 or 5 years at UT Austin. I want to thank all of you for coming and supporting your friends or family members or fellow students here in this session. It is really helpful to have an audience, and your questions are welcome as well. Throughout this session, each of the presenters will be speaking for about 8 minutes, and then taking questions. The way that will work is that you'll type your questions in the chat where they'll be visible to me, and then I will convey them to the presenters during the Q&A session that follows each of their respective presentations. And I may have some additional questions of my own. If there's time remaining at the end of the session, since we are a group of 4 presenters instead of 5, as some of the sessions have, there might be an opportunity to address any additional questions that we didn't have time to answer during each student's Q&A session. With that, I am going to go ahead and begin the session by introducing Irene Ameena. The title of her thesis is Burdened: Experiences of Eldest-Born Daughters in Immigrant Families. Irene.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. So yeah, like Professor Valentine said, I'll be talking a little bit about my creative thesis, which is a collection of short stories about eldest-born daughters in immigrant families. And so I know it's a little bit of a mouthful of a term, so I'm going to talk a little bit about where that kind of interest came from. So here's me with my 2 younger brothers. I immigrated here when I was 7 years old, and my family is originally from the southern state of Kerala in India. So obviously I fit the title of eldest born daughter in immigrant family, but growing up, it's not like I necessarily ascribed to that or put that label on myself. I really started thinking about it when I saw a lot of online discourse about it. So I started seeing a lot of tweets that a lot of other people who have the same position in their family felt like they had to balance a lot of people's emotional needs. They felt a greater sense of responsibility. They felt like they had been adultified at a young age. A lot of different themes that I started to realize had been true for me too, and that I realized that were true for a lot of people who held this role in their family. And so I realized that there's some really unique ways that people who hold this role of eldest born daughter in immigrant family experience their lives and approach things that happen in their family. So I started thinking deeper about how it's affected me on a personal level. And so thinking about it, a lot of the ways it affected me is feeling parental responsibility over my own siblings, things like ignoring my own emotions and needs, and then kind of a need to fix problems and manage conflicts. So don't get me wrong, there's a lot of great things about being the oldest sister, and I'm very close to my family, but these are the kind of themes that I noticed that affected me and that I saw a lot talking to other people and seeing this online discourse about being this role in your family. So I've always wanted to be an author, and I've always loved creative writing. So I thought it'd be a great idea to do short stories, especially because this is a story that I don't think has really been told, especially not in literature. And so before I started writing, I really wanted to get a broader and deeper understanding of what kind of stories people had to share. And I wanted to interview people. So I did 7 interviews, and then I had a Google form, and I distributed that through different identity-based Facebook groups and on Twitter. And I used some of the submissions So using these submissions, I didn't directly use interviews to create characters. It wasn't like each interview was one character. A lot of the characters are amalgamations of different people I talked to. And really the interviews really helped me just get an idea of how different facets of people's identities come together to shape their experiences, help me build settings and realistic settings and plots and family dynamics. That was a big thing. And so I've ended up with 6 stories. Each story is about a different person, a different eldest born daughter, and it's a slice of their life. And I feel very close to all of them after writing about them. And yeah, I really enjoyed writing about them. So some of the themes that I kind of thought about, have been thinking about as I've been writing. So the first one is racial melancholia, which is a term coined by these 2 researchers who talk about this persisting feeling of sadness and grief that a lot of immigrants in America feel, that they've perceived that a lot of immigrants in America feel, or children of immigrants or children of immigrants. And it basically describes a source of like grief and mourning for something that you can't quite name. It's a really interesting topic. I highly recommend you read up on it if you haven't heard of it. But I thought about how my characters might feel that melancholia, how that might express themselves, and how generational trauma, how generational pain and generational learning could affect the different things that happen in their stories. The second thing I thought about is intersectionality, which is a term coined by a sociologist named Kimberly Crenshaw. And that's really important to consider just because, for example, I know what it's like to protect a sibling from a conflict, but I don't know what that would be like for Ty, who is one of my characters. Ty is non-binary, Ty's from a working class family, and Ty is indigenous. So how do these different parts of our identity just affect the ways that we experience things in our lives, right? I can only write about what I know, but by doing research and by building like whole complex characters, I wanted to make sure I'm considering all the facets of someone's identity. And then the last one is avoiding damage-centered work, which comes from E.B. Tuck's idea of how sometimes when we write about people who've been marginalized, we really focus on damage and trauma and harm. And so I really wanted to move away from that and also include joy and include love and build complex characters. So it's just not just kind of fetishizing sadness. So I thought I'd take the last couple minutes to share just a couple of the characters, just to give you an idea of what kind of themes I explored. So one of my characters, one story is about a character called Eniola. Eniola is 19 years old and she's Nigerian American and she has 3 younger siblings. And some of the things that kind of come up in her story is she's adultified, which is a theme that came up a lot in the interviews. So she's expected to carry a lot of burden and responsibility, even though her parents they're not necessarily neglectful, but she just carries an extra burden as the eldest sibling. And one big one that I noticed from a lot of interviews is she's not allowed to be the fun sibling. So sometimes, you can be allies with your siblings and mess around with them. But a lot of times when you hold that mantle of responsibility, you're not allowed to have that same sort of relationship with your siblings. She's very misunderstood. She's very fiercely protective. And yeah, I talk about her like she's real because she feels so real to me. But yeah, her story is about protecting people and being misunderstood, I guess. And the second one I wanted to touch on is Manahil. Manahil is a Pakistani American Muslim girl, and you see her at different stages of her life. So at 13, at 19, at 20, at 21. The big watershed moment in Manahil's life is when she's 13 and her parents catch her holding hands with a boy or find out she held hands with a boy. And this minor incident basically leads to just so much pain in the story. And her story is a lot about control and love. So for her parents, control and love are very much conflated. And her story is about trust and getting that kind of unconditional love and trust. She's also held responsible for her younger sister's actions. And then as she grows, her parents are more lenient on her younger sister, which is something that I read in a couple of the Google Form submissions that happens. And yeah, these are just a little excerpts. So this one, she's having a panic attack in this excerpt, and her parents expect her to be very composed. So they continuously pretend like nothing's happening when she's having panic attacks. Okay, yeah, and I think I should be out of time. So I'm just going to thank Professor Valentine and Dr. Lisa Moore for being my supervisor and second reader, helping me ideate, write, revise, and assess. And then my family for their love and support and for making me the eldest born daughter. So I had to stop it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Irene. So, I think when people hear that you're doing research and that you have Google documents and you're collecting responses to like surveys that you've submitted, that they might be more familiar with research in like sociological or other academic fields where people would be after a much larger sample size. You're talking about doing interviews with just a handful of people. So and you did a good job in your presentation of explaining sort of what you found in those interviews and how you applied it in your thesis. But I wonder whether it would be useful in this context, writing fiction, for you to draw on existing research, and whether or not you considered that as a possible source material to help you create these characters using survey data that was collected by other researchers, or finding sort of generalized results where people have studied this, the experiences of firstborn daughters in a more sort of systematic way. Would that be useful to you?
I think it potentially could be useful. I don't think it exists. It doesn't exist. I've definitely looked into it. There's definitely some studies done on like women of color, or even firstborn children. I found studies, but at the same time, one, it doesn't exist. Two, I'm not necessarily like trying to create a generalizable, like my interviews never were meant to create generalizable conclusions, and I'm not necessarily trying to represent everybody, or represent what the experience of being an eldest born daughter in an immigrant family definitively looks like, or even looks like for most people, right? I'm just trying to tell the stories of these people, and then let the character tell their own story. Yeah.
Do you have intentions to share this work with a larger audience? And what do you hope they might find in it, if so?
Yeah, I hope to, once I have the stories more polished, I hope to. I don't know exactly what that'll look like. And even though I'm not trying to represent people, I still think there are underrepresented cultures and aspects of being a certain race or a certain birth order, that I still hope people find some level of relatability in. So I tried to like realistically weave in like cultural items, cultural like language, foods, so some level of relatability, and seeing some aspects of yourself, whether or not you're the oldest born daughter. I would hope that people read it and just see some aspect of their own lives, as well as I think a lot of the stories include characters who are very dynamic, in the sense that you'll have a parent who is both controlling and shows an extraordinary amount of love towards the child. So those kind of aspects are things that I think a lot of people can relate to, and a lot of people can find meaning in. And I hope other people get that from reading the stories.
Great. And there's a question in the chat. Did you think that there was any aspect of creative writing that you felt like you got to practice more through the thesis? I guess, were there particular skill sets within creative writing that this thesis really helped you exercise?
Yeah, I think as someone who has some background in theater and I really enjoy playwriting, I think I was very tempted to use dialogue as a bit of a crutch. So I think a lot of my stories do have a lot of dialogue and rely on dialogue to tell convey a lot of meaningful information. But I think one thing I got to explore more is using less dialogue and relying more on action and setting. Building setting was something big that I didn't really venture off into much when I was doing creative writing before. So I got to practice building setting, practice using the idea of action and inaction as action. How do I convey people's meanings and feelings through what they do?
Audrey in the chat has asked if you could share a little bit more about the experience of writing characters whose identities you don't share. So, I mean, you addressed this a little bit in your presentation. It's certainly an area that people are conscious of and sensitive about it. Currently, writing characters who have different ethnic identity or different gender identity than the author, and I guess there are some craft dimensions to that as well as ethical dimensions.
Yeah. So one is, I guess by craft dimensions, I don't know if you mean by like having snippets of other languages. So for example, like for a character who speaks Spanish, how do I include some Spanish in a way that is doesn't come off as tacky, to be honest. Like a lot of times writing that includes other languages ends up kind of inserting in a very tacky way. So being meaningful and realistic, I think part of that is having people read my writing who do share those identities. So having like other readers, which I've been trying to do. Also doing my research, making sure that I'm not relying on things I've just read, because even though there were, writings and texts that inspired me, I just don't want to rely on fiction. I want to do my research. So doing research, having readers of that identity. Yeah, and then avoiding things that might just be tokenizing or not inserting facets of identity or their race in places that it doesn't necessarily belong. Trying to think about what could be realistic and meaningful. But yeah, it's a bit of a vague answer, but that's what I've been thinking about.
Okay, and this will probably be our last question for you. Pooja asks in the chat, was there anything that was particularly challenging about this project? Maybe things that you hadn't anticipated going into it.
So I think I talked a little bit about how these stories aren't supposed to represent every experience out there or generalize, but I think that was a bit of it took me a while to kind of come to that understanding. I think when I started doing those interviews, I came in with this idea that the interviews were going to help me make my stories more realistic, but then I started thinking, like, realistic for who? Like, what does that even mean? Like, what does realistic mean? Everybody, even if you share, even if on paper you look like you have the same aspects of your identity as somebody else, things still end up different. Like, experiences are still unique. Nothing's going to be relatable to everybody, and I shouldn't try to be. So I think something that that Dr. Moore, my second reader, said, like, always sticks with me. She told me this early on in the process, but I just had to keep coming back to it. She said, like, let the language take you into an inventive world that doesn't bear the burden of representation. And I just love, that's a direct quote because I really liked how she said that. I think it happens a lot when you write about stories that aren't usually told, right? Like a lot of books that, if you write a book about a Muslim character, there's not that many books about Muslim characters. So you kind of get expected to tell the stories of all Muslims out there, or you feel like you have to represent everybody. So not falling into that pitfall and just letting my character stories stand by themselves.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Irene.
Thank you.
All right. Our next presentation will come from Jay Anand. The title of his thesis is "You Belong Here: Understanding the History of Exclusionary Immigration and Evaluating Education and Workforce Outcomes of Undocumented Adolescents in Texas." Jay.
Thank you, Professor Valentine. And also thank you, Irene. That was a really great presentation, and it's very clear how intentional you are with your work. Professor Valentine just said my title. It's also a mouthful. Got to include everything in there. I think the main three parts to this kind of topic is first understanding the history of unauthorized immigration to the United States, how history and policies affect undocumented adolescents from Mexico and Central America specifically, and what steps can be taken to support these students. In terms of why I chose this topic, from an academic perspective, I think a lot of it is motivated from history and policy being linked together and wanting to understand how that history informs policies affecting these students. Second, being undocumented adolescents facing extreme stressors that are unique to their position. And while they are high school students facing similar kind of stressors other high school students face, they do have circumstances that are unique to their position, being between the first and second generation of immigrants. And finally, there have been both successes and gaps in policy responses for these students, and wanting a better understanding of what works and also what can be done better, I think, and hopefully better inform responses for these students in particular. On a personal level, I got a chance to be part of the Bromley Scholars Program last year, in which we spent a year learning about policy and learning about how to be better policy writers and I guess consumers. And I think a lot of this project was born out of trying to flesh that a lot more with support from Professor Holmeston, who helped guide me throughout that project last year as well. So to start with the methodology, the survey of history was guided by Dr. Terry Ripak and Dr. Maynard's Impossible Subjects, which looks at that history of unauthorized immigration, followed by a review of qualitative studies of stressors faced by undocumented adolescents, followed by data analysis on American community survey data on poverty and college enrollment by these students, and finally, recommendations based on existing successes and gaps in policy. I include this quote by Dr. Tracy McConnell, which talks about how we reinforce institutions and oppression through personal interactions. And then by speaking them into existence, we kind of move back into the institutions themselves. And I think this was really important to mention just because I think that the interpersonal interactions are necessary as part of understanding the history, but that the institutions themselves help create those interactions too. So understanding both is really important to make sure we have a full-fledged idea of what's happening and why. To start with the history itself, I think we have to go back to the 1875 Page Act, which is the first time we see legislation at a national level that aims to restrict a specific population. The Page Act of 1875 sought to restrict the immigration of Chinese women to the United States, mainly because they were perceived to be immoral actors because of the practice of prostitution within the Bay Area and San Francisco by Chinese women. A big part of this kind of immigration was due to just different expected roles of women in Chinese society versus American society. Along with that was a desire to regulate the morality of immigrants, as well as a desire to respond to economic anxieties regarding immigrants seeking out labor within the United States. Following the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, we saw the 1924 Immigration Act, which imposed severe restrictive quotas on immigrants themselves. Furthermore, it didn't seek to specifically restrict different types of groups, but by being colorblind, it aimed to do so because it prioritized different parts that were desirable more than others. Specifically, whiter countries from North and Western Europe were given priority over countries from Asia, Latin America, and South and Eastern Europe themselves. Going into the later 1900s, we see that in response to World War II and the rise of communism, there's a desire to restrict immigration from perceivably harmful countries or perceivably possibly countries that could spread communism to the United States, which led to the McCarran-Walter Act, which imposed even more restrictive quotas based on earlier projections from the census. Immediately responding to this 1952 act was a liberal critique from a coalition of both immigrants, professors, and liberal politicians who wanted to both rectify the kind of harms done in the immigration system, but also seek to resolve tensions at home during the Civil Rights Act, which culminated in the 1965 Immigration Act. The highlight of this act was an equal number of spots for immigrants from all countries, along with kind of the idea of equality among races through the immigration system. But one point that Dr. Maynard makes really well is that the logical form of equality was a win domestically for politicians who wanted to help address civil rights tensions and help address racial issues at home, but wasn't actually a very effective issue in terms of helping immigrants because it didn't recognize the different problems or structures at immigrant countries themselves. Point she makes well is, why does New Zealand have the same restriction as countries such as Mexico? And this kind of perspective is centering the United States in terms of how it took in immigrants rather than considering where are the immigrants coming from themselves. Finally, in terms of looking at exclusionary immigration today, two recent acts at the latter half of the 1900s that are important to look at are the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986 and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act in the 1990s. These two acts sought to punish employers who employed undocumented workers, as well as create some sort of amnesty for these workers for a short period of time. However, in the 1990s, the IRA sought to punish undocumented immigrants mostly because of perceptions of Democrats being weaker on immigration, as well as a concern regarding constructed mythologies of what immigrants may bring to the United States. This kind of sentiment continued in terms of constructing what maybe an illegal immigrant would look like, or what fears may come from what these unauthorized immigration may bring. DACA, passed under the Obama administration, is also relevant towards the conversation because it created a temporary stay for childhood arrivals, as well as gave a possible pathway towards a work permit, which allowed for students and children to stay longer. All this to say that in recent history, these constructs aren't new or only born out of one presidency or one administration, but rather a continuation of a history of exclusive immigration that's interwoven with inclusive perceptions or inclusive policies themselves. In terms of shifting towards undocumented adolescents, I just wanted to focus on specifically the experience of immigration itself affecting how students are integrated into their communities, and use a framework from Professor Rudder that looks at how students interact with the microsystem, which may be their local community, the outer microsystem, which can be their school, and the macrosystem of society at large, and how the host country accepts them. In terms of stressors they face, we see four major ones specifically from undocumented adolescents. The first being language acquisition, or how they're integrated into mainstream high school education. The second being discrimination in the classroom, bolstered by anti-immigrant sentiment, as well as lack of involvement from teacher or counselors. Disconnected social networks, where teachers or counselors can be really important towards their post-secondary jobs or post-secondary education. And finally, high childhood poverty rates informed by restrictive policies, as well as a lack of or limited human capital for these students and their families to advance within American society. In terms of looking at data analysis, I specifically wanted to look at the high rates of child poverty and understand both how they affect students and which groups maybe benefit from in-state tuition policies within Texas. What we found was that foreign-born children from Mexico and Latin America were specifically at higher rates compared to other minority groups within the United States, as well as when we look at gender, both women-led households and girls face higher rates of poverty themselves. Finally, in-state tuition policies most likely benefited older male students. Wrapping up here quickly, I feel like going over time.
Yeah, you're just about at the bound of your time there.
In terms of recommendations, just looking for both trauma-informed responses in high school, looking to help better support counselors and for supporting students, and looking for increased funding at the community college and state level. Larger themes I can talk about at a later point, but thank you to my professors for showing me grace and guidance through this year. Thank you for Caroline, and thank you for Angela for listening to me with a perspective only a graduate can understand. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Well, I think I will do you the favor of asking as a question in your Q&A time. Tell us about the larger themes.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Valentine.
Yeah.
In terms of themes, I think those are like the more interesting points that we brought up. But the first is that exclusive immigration has always been a part of immigrant responses to certain groups, and that's because we've constructed hierarchies in terms of what we want in our immigrants, or what we just desire in terms of people who come here. And even when we pass inclusive policies, we try to include certain groups at the expense of others. The second is that counselors and school teachers play a very large role in the outcomes of undocumented students. So while we may want to look at the structure, we also have to understand how those interpersonal interactions affect students themselves. And then finally, is just understanding that poverty both affects these students in particular adversely, but when we look at gender, it also affects women and girls, particularly even more, because as Professor Holmson helped explain to me, women enter roles that have limited human capital or limited networks. So while men may enter into fields that they learn about opportunities more readily, women enter into work that doesn't allow for them to learn about other opportunities as quickly or advance rapidly within their current role.
So your thesis, I understand from the title and from your presentation that it was about understanding the history of these policies and their consequences. I wonder, though, whether you have thought about policy prescriptions that would be informed by by what you've learned in this research.
No, absolutely. I think on one level, in the academic sphere, it's easy to make a prescription. And then in reality, I think that's kind of what held me back on even further prescribing, just because I guess I am wary of how much change can come. But I think in terms of prescriptions, I think just recognizing that different countries had different needs and going from there is really important in terms of how we treat immigration from Mexico and Latin America in particular. I think both having a larger quota system as well as supporting a family system even more would be helpful. Further from that, I think that as we see in recent news about arrivals from those countries to the United States, I think that's not as much drawn out of administrations as much as stressors and structural reasons within those countries themselves. And I think that understanding this is a long-term issue that isn't really born out of administrations as much as it's going to be a constant theme because of both the United States interactions with those countries as well as problems in those countries themselves is a more helpful perspective. I think in terms of further like policy prescriptions, integration within local communities is also still a problem. In Texas in particular, Professor Wasson, my supervisor, has done work on how to better integrate immigrants from these countries into Dallas. And I think hopefully trying to expand a kind of framework where we help integrate immigrants as well could be helpful too, to make sure that not only do they arrive here, but when they do arrive here, they're set up for success as best as they can be.
Thank you. Irene asks in the chat, you talked a bit about the construction of the narratives of what an undocumented immigrant means in the for the US. Could you speak about how those narratives were conveyed through a politician's speech or some other means?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really interesting point, especially after the 1965 Immigration Act, mainly because with the idea of legal or formal equality for all countries, it didn't recognize that there was a greater need for immigration from Mexico and Latin America in itself, which led to increased unauthorized immigration from those countries, just because even though the restriction was put in place, that didn't really interact with why or how much those immigrants needed to immigrate from those spaces, which led to the perception that immigrants from those countries were either deliberately trying to break the law or seeking to get into our nation for those kind of opportunities themselves, which wasn't a narrative that was extended to other immigrants as much. Further from that, especially in 1986, we saw President Reagan try to extend the idea that it was on employers to help regulate this kind of immigration system rather than sometimes the federal government, as well as that this was a one-time amnesty policy for immigrants and one that shouldn't be expected to be a long-term one, but needs to be done. President Clinton in particular wanted to also appear harsher on immigration just because of concerns that Democrats were not doing enough to be tough on crime or to want to be competitive with Republicans in upcoming elections. So domestic politics did play a large role in trying to, I guess, win that kind of domestic support. So creating the immigrant to be kind of policy issue that can be won upon, or the kind of narrative that they're a problem that domestic issues, I guess, can resolve. I think is the main way that that's been constructed. Since then, especially, I think in the past decade or so, we've seen both rising anti-immigrant sentiment through the previous administration, but also before that, the perception that a lot of the value of these undocumented adolescents is in their potential for labor or potential for being integrated into American society, which is a complicated issue that I'm not sure exactly how I feel about, but the economics of kind of their presence here is been a large theme throughout.
Just on a personal note, I'm curious, what brought you to this project as your capstone, your thesis?
I think on a personal note, I had personal friends who were undocumented in high school, and then coming through UT have learned more about this population and specifically seen both how policies have helped and failed these students in particular. And I think being a history student, I wanted to spend a lot of time on the history, and honestly spent probably too much time on the history, as my supervisors and second reader would say. But I think a lot of it was motivated by seeing both how this, I think how these students are both like served and failed within our current system, and wanting a better understanding of that.
Okay, thank you. That is about your time there. So we'll move forward, but I think we may have time at the end to bring all four of our panelists back and pose any remaining questions. Oh, well, Angela has one here. I'm going to save that, Angela, and we'll do it at the end. All right. So our next presenter is Mark Csoros. The title of his thesis. Just one second. My screen has been co-opted here, so I had your thesis title in front of me, Mark, but it.
Oh, hang on. I will.
You could stop share for just a second there. Sorry. Yeah, the title of Mark's thesis is A New Paradigm: The Habitus of Federal Theology from the Scottish Covenanters to Early America. Right. Thank you, Mark. Go ahead. Go ahead. You can proceed. Yeah, thank you.
I was just getting it reset up.
Sorry.
All righty. Well, as Professor Valentine just said, my thesis is about the habitus of federal theology from the Scottish Covenanters to early America. And I got interested in this thesis kind of because of my interest in law and policy. I'm headed to law school in the fall. And then also because of my interest in how people make decisions, which I get to explore in my other major, which is marketing. But the seeds for the way that manifested were planted in fall of 2017 in my very first semester here at UT, when I took a teaching seminar from Professor Samuel Baker, which is on English literature and history. And as my capstone project for that course, I studied the transatlantic cultural and ideological flow from Scotland to the United States. And as juvenile as that research was, it did come across some really interesting cultural artifacts. So we have Tennessee whiskey and Kentucky bourbon because of the Scottish whiskey making tradition. We have NASCAR because of the Scottish whiskey smuggling tradition. Our term for redneck is partially attributable to the red handkerchief that some Presbyterians or Covenanters would wear around their necks as a symbol of their affiliations. And then the works of James Madison, we have a fairly strong link to a Scottish mode of thought that was popularized by someone named John Witherspoon, who was the president of the College of New Jersey, which ended up becoming Princeton. But at the time that James Madison went there, it was still the College of New Jersey. And so in this project for this thesis, I wanted to find some more deeper and meaningful and more nuanced connections between Scotland and its ideologies and between early American political thought. And what I landed on was the Covenanter ideology of a federal theology, or a habitus. So the first thing we have to know is who the Covenanters are. Well, they're Scottish Reformed Protestants or Puritans, and they're mainly Presbyterians, but not totally. And as the name implies, there were people who signed covenants, most notably the National Covenant and Solemn League and Covenant. Then, as the title of my thesis implies, there were people who had this shared habitus of federal, also called covenant theology. So the next question is, what is federal theology or covenant theology? Well, in the purely religious sense, it just means that people understand their relationship with God in terms of an explicit covenant or agreement between them and their God. But in the more broad usage, in the way that it was understood by the Scottish Covenanters, it was a more comprehensive understanding. It was a habitus that was a framework for relationships that were both individual and collective, and that existed in the religious and the civil spheres. And so it existed on the level of individual and corporate covenant and on religious and civil arenas. And under this habitus, all those things were interconnected. So covenants weren't existing over just one dimension. Every single one was connected to each of the other three dimensions. So the next question then is, what is a habitus? If it's that important to the Covenanters and it's that complex and nuanced, what actually is this habitus? Well, it's a term pioneered by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. And it's defined as a way of describing the embodiment of social structures and histories of an individual. And more specifically, in a way that better explains that, it's a set of dispositions that is internal to an individual, but it reflects external social structures, and that it shapes individual perceptions and actions. Most importantly, it can result in differing practices, even under a shared habitus. So why is it so important to use this paradigm of a habitus with regards to the study of the Scottish Covenanters? Well, the first and most important reason is that Covenanters are often stereotyped in popular perception. You know, we think of Scotland, we think of Braveheart, we think of William Wallace, we think of, you know, they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedoms. And that perception, that common ideology, that sort of word association also tends to apply to the Covenanters themselves. They're seen as stridently anti-crown, anti-Stuart authority. They're seen as completely Presbyterian. They're seen as religious fanatics. And they're also seen as a homogenous block. There's not a lot of nuance in these common perceptions of the Covenanters. So against that backdrop, the historiography of the recent few years has tended to overcorrect. And so they've focused on these different segments, to use a marketing term, and on the divisions and differences in ideologies and practices within the Covenanting movement. And they've emphasized it to the extent that they've almost reached a point where they can no longer say that there's a single and unified Covenanting movement. What that means is recent historiography of the Covenanters is a bit like an Ouroboros. It's consuming itself. We'll have works that are published on the Covenanters or on the Covenanting movement, but at the same time, those works will argue that there is no single and distinct Covenanting movement. So using the habitus paradigm helps rectify these difference between popular conceptions and the recent scholarly historiography that has sought to kind of deconstruct the movement and break it up into individual constituent parts. But what it also does is it helps us analyze the effects and then trace those effects of the habitus of federal theology. And the three of those that we'll look at here are in new political engagement, compactual popular consent, and then sort of a prototype of the big tent federalism that manifests in the United States. So in 17th century Scotland, the emphasis on covenants is something that was important, is something that was an acknowledgement of an individual's agreement with God and with their community and with the civic authorities, led to a massive increase in political engagement. It made the stakes higher, so that abstaining from political engagement was seen to bear a higher cost, and engaging in it was seen to create a higher reward. In 18th century America, that was also the case. As the renowned political historian and scholar Hannah Arendt noted, that revolution was affected in the United States primarily because people were in the body politic. They were engaged in their communities. They were active in town hall meetings. The second part of that is that covenant theology sort of began the popularization of the idea of compactual popular consent. Under the habitus of federal theology, civil authorities weren't exempt from this kind of covenant. They were also obligated to follow certain guidelines regarding the church, regarding their duties to their constituents. And in this habitus, there was a clear penalty for kings that didn't follow those guidelines. The understanding was that the people were obligated and allowed to rise up and reject their rulers if the rulers weren't upholding their end of the bargain. And the same thing manifests in the Declaration of Independence when it says that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This idea that we can trace from the habitus of federal theology shows up again in the United States Declaration of Independence. And finally, the last one is this idea of a big tent federalism, that we can be under the same sort of covenant, the same agreement, the same social contract, at the same time have wildly differing ideas about how we're supposed to implement and uphold that covenant. In 17th century Scotland, the dictates of individual conscience, when combined with national subscriptions to broadly worded covenants, led to these divergent practices and beliefs. And in America, when we have a constitution that's designed to be interpreted and amended and defined differently by different groups of people, but at the same time, it's a document that's nationally ratified, we get things like a Bill of Rights, which had to be added. We get things like a Missouri Compromise. We get a Dred Scott decision, a Civil War Reconstruction Amendment. We have differing ideas about how we're supposed to relate to each other under the covenant, under the contract, under the compact of the Constitution. So just as the Scottish Covenanters would often have divisions because of these differing understandings under a shared habitus, so we too in America have these differing understandings under a shared constitution. So thank you all for listening. I appreciate your time very much. And I'm open for questions if y'all have them.
Yes, it looks like, thank you, Mark. It looks like Brooke has posed a question in the chat asking for you to speak a little bit further about your research process. You've shared with us some of your findings. Can you talk a little bit about the methodology through which you collected those findings?
Sure. The research process for this was very much a Plan II research process, in that it was very interdisciplinary and very challenging, but at the same time very fun and very rewarding, because there's so many different elements and aspects and realms of scholarship that factor into this discussion. So there's not just the history of Scotland and the history of the United States. There's also the history of transatlantic ideology flow. There's also the history of politics and political theory. There's the history of theology. So, I'll have sources on the same page that are pure historians, from the Scottish St. Andrews old school of Scottish history, and also, divinity students who wrote their thesis on a particular aspect of Reformed theology that manifests in this kind of covenant or federal theology. So it was a lot of fun to do research on, but at the same time, following up all those leads was a pretty challenging process that is still, in some sense, in effect, as I make revisions ahead of the final deadline.
You began by showing us some of the, I guess, maybe cultural artifacts of the Covenanters, things like the red bandanas appearing in our diction as rednecks. NASCAR, was it? I'd be curious to hear exactly what the connection is there. But I guess the bigger question here is, so certainly Scottish American identity is still sort of an extant thing. Does the sort of the history of the Covenanters persist today is as more than just those sort of like artifacts, or are there larger, is there sort of more conspicuous evidence of this in contemporary society?
One of the reasons why I focused on the ideological impact, or even the formal connection between the Covenanters' federal theology and the United States federalism, is because it's really difficult to track the movements of the Covenanters into the United States, because they were very persecuted in England in the 1600s, and a lot of them made their way to the United States through Ulster, Ireland. And so the artifacts that I wanted to focus on was less so the tangible things that got me interested in this project, the whiskey and the NASCAR and the smuggling, but more so the patterns of thought, the habitus, as I say, that it was common in the Covenanters, and then influenced the United States somewhat just formally in that they share similarities. And then one of the big ways that it influenced the United States is it was secularized through the social contract theory of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. And then it manifested, as I wrote in the work of James Madison to an extent, as well as in the Declaration and Thomas Jefferson's writings as well.
Excellent.
If we have time at the end, I'll tell the NASCAR story.
Yes, yeah, I'd like to hear it. We have time for maybe one more question from the audience, if anybody would like to pose one. Okay, well, we will bring you back out here, Mark, and we'll have some questions for everybody at the end. All right. Yeah, I agree, Jay. I'd like to hear the NASCAR story as well. Let's proceed with our next thesis presentation. And if you can just wait a second before sharing the screen there, Ethan. Our final presenter in this session is Ethan Masucol, and the title of his thesis is Islands Apart, a current look at the Chinese community in the Philippines. Ethan.
All right, can y'all see that?
Yes.
Good. All right, hi, my name's Ethan Masucol, and my thesis looks at patterns of discrimination against the Chinese community in the Philippines. So first, I want to talk about my inspiration for this project. If you look up China-Philippine relations in the news or on Google, the main thing you're probably going to see is the territorial dispute between the two countries in the South China Sea. Second, a lot of my Filipino family and friends have negative stereotypes of ethnic Chinese. They say that they're untrustworthy, or they're abusive employers, or they unfairly control the entire economy. Political science literature says that if you have conflict between two countries, that usually leads to domestic backlash against relevant diasporas or ethnic minorities. So here we have conflict with China, and then already existing negative attitudes towards the Chinese. So my question is, why is there little or unremarkable backlash in the form of discriminatory legislation or social marginalization against Chinese Filipinos? So my presentation today will just be a quick review of the history of the Chinese in the Philippines, China-Philippine relations, some quantitative analysis, and then a brief comparison with Indonesia. So first I want to talk about Chinese in the Philippines, and this is a period 1500 to the present. So I'm just going to mention a few major themes and trends. So first we have the Spanish colonial era. So the Spaniards uplifted Chinese merchants and traders to facilitate general economic development. At the same time, they curtailed their political rights to ensure they would never have the collective power to challenge Spanish rule. This disconnect helped the Spaniards scapegoat the Chinese and redirect Filipino anger for economic competition and a general lack of political power in the colony. One thing to note is that Spanish Catholic missions offered a force of cultural integration for the Chinese into the wider Philippine community. The Spanish encouraged intermarriage between Chinese and Filipinos, the only requirement being that both parties be Catholic. And this led to the establishment of a Chinese mestizo community, a community of people that can claim both ethnic Chinese and ethnic Filipino ancestry. And this is important because this is the basis for the Chinese community in the Philippines today. In 1898, the Americans took over the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. The flood of American capital and investment was a golden era for the Chinese business community. But unfortunately, at this time, the Chinese Exclusion Acts were also going on in the United States, and they began to affect the Chinese in the Philippines. So naturalization was made more difficult, and now all ethnic Chinese were deemed aliens, even Chinese mestizos. This facilitated greater social divisions between the Filipinos and the Chinese. In essence, Filipinos started to adopt these xenophobic racial values to gain American goodwill for eventual independence. Post-independence, after 1946, the Philippines for several years went on an economic nationalism drive. So Filipinos now had political control, so they also wanted control over the economy. And this, of course, targeted Chinese business owners who had largest share of several industries. Also, anti-communism sentiments cast suspicion on the Chinese with the rise of communist China. This like trend of discrimination against the Chinese finally reversed with the Marcos regime from 1965 to 1986. He normalized relations with the People's Republic of China, so that removed most of the anti-communist sentiments directed at the Chinese. He ended the alien status of ethnic Chinese and allowed them to become citizens. And through education reform and the reinvigoration of Chinese communities, the Chinese were integrated as a cultural minority. Okay, and then really quick, China-Philippines relations. So the main point, as I mentioned earlier, is maritime territorial disputes. So over there, there's a map that you can, on the left, there's a map that you can see different island claims. The main point of contention is the Spratly Islands. But Philippine administrations have had a tendency to downplay these disputes in favor of other factors in the China-Philippine relationship. And I have a picture of President Duterte with President Xi Jinping because his administration is like the best embodiment of this. So despite several maritime incidents, President Duterte has focused on positive relations with China. And that means increasing trade and investment, particularly in infrastructure, facilitating tourism and education exchange, counterterrorism cooperation, and China supporting Duterte's drug war, and most recently, COVID-19 relief, mainly with vaccine diplomacy. That is this, I do want to say that tensions still exist. China has not fulfilled a lot of its infrastructure promises, which has made some Filipinos angry. And China continues to be aggressive in the South China Sea. Just this month, encroaching on islands within the Philippines exclusive economic zone. But overall, Philippine administrations take the more practical approach of trying to maximize the positive aspects of relations with China to get economic benefits. Really quick, here's my quantitative analysis. I did text analysis on 200 articles from both the Chinese and Philippine governments to track rhetoric over time. My results show a decline in positive rhetoric throughout the Duterte administration, and that makes sense because as China continues to be aggressive in the South China Sea or does not fulfill infrastructure promises, then Philippine goodwill will go down. However, as you can see, as a percentage of word count compared to negative rhetoric, positive rhetoric still is overwhelmingly there's still much more positive rhetoric than negative. And then also I did a public opinion survey. I had 1,500 respondents across the Philippines, and I was gauging attitudes towards both China and the ethnic Chinese. Just a couple conclusions from my findings. There was strong nationalist fervor towards the territorial disputes, but there was also observed recognition of other aspects of the relationship with China, mainly economic. And then also the Chinese were seen as culturally different, but there was a distinction between the Chinese in the Philippines who had a established economic role and were seen as Filipino versus foreign Chinese, both in mainland China and in Taiwan. And then really quick, compared to Indonesia, both Indonesia and the Philippines are in the maritime Malay world. They both had European colonizers, but in Indonesia, the Chinese have had a much harder time compared to the Philippines. There's been race riots throughout the 20th century, targeting the Chinese, and differences include closer ties for the Chinese community in Indonesia to China, Indonesia forcing assimilation instead of integrating the Chinese as a cultural minority, and overall worse relations between Indonesia and China, as opposed to the focus on good relations that started with the Marcos regime. Those are just my final, just reiterating final conclusion. Chinese in the Philippines are an integrated cultural minority, and the Philippines focuses on positive China relations, which is why you don't see backlash against the ethnic Chinese there. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ethan. So a question about methodology first. Can you tell us a little bit about how you measured and quantified rhetoric in your textual analysis of articles?
Yeah, so I ran these articles through a, what was it called? Through a program that categorized words into, that categorized words into different categories, I guess. Yes, so words that like had positive emotion, like cooperation or friend or like good neighbor, would be categorized into positive emotions, whereas like aggression or encroachment or incursion would be into negative emotion. And I gauged percentage of these categories out of a word count for rhetoric between both China and the Philippines.
Mm-hmm. And was that an existing tool, or is that something that you coded, or?
Oh, that was an existing tool. Yes, I did not code. I did not create
just
that
curious
word analysis program. Yeah.
Yeah. Brooke asks in the chat whether the sort of downplaying of tensions with China is mostly about Duterte, or is that a sentiment that is sort of reflected as well by sort of local level government people and maybe by the population?
Yeah, so I didn't mention this in my presentation, but as part of my thesis, I interviewed several provincial and local security and security officials, mainly in the Palawan province, which is the closest province to the South China Sea. It also has jurisdiction over the Philippines' claims in the South China Sea. And it was really interesting because, I mentioned to them, like, you guys are the ones who have to deal with Chinese incursions into Philippine waters. And then they reply, yes, but you know what? We have a student exchange with China. We send a lot of our students over to universities in Hainan. So it was really interesting to see how they too focus on the positive aspects of the relationship, even though they're the ones on the front line dealing with Chinese aggressiveness.
You mentioned in your presentation that U.S. foreign policy is a sort of a complicating factor here, especially concerning like overlapping interests in the South China Sea. And I suppose that most prominently would be U.S. foreign policy with Taiwan. Can you elaborate a little bit about how things have evolved just in the past year or two under a new administration?
So throughout the Trump administration, President Duterte didn't follow a policy of decoupling, but like taking a step back from his alliance with the United States and trying to gauge what he could gain from China. With the Biden administration focuses more on Taiwan. I haven't seen much on particularly. Oh wait, well, the Biden administration has said that they will support the Philippines in against Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, but the Philippines seems to be following the same policy of trying to downplay tensions in themselves.
Okay. Irene asks, how was it you were able to get 1,500 responses? And she wants to know whether this survey was written and distributed in English. What was the methodology there of your survey?
So we fielded the survey through a regional market research company. They had an existing online panel of possible respondents in the Philippines, and they just use internet surveys to get the responses. Yes, the English was distributed in the survey was distributed in English. And that's not much of an issue because thanks to American colonization, English is taught in all Filipino schools.
Mm-hmm. And Mark asked about how this topic affects you personally, and I'm curious about that as well. How did you come to this as your thesis project?
Yeah, so I'm Filipino, if you can't already tell. So I'm always interested in anything Philippines, and one of my other majors is Chinese, and I just remember telling my grandparents that, and them saying like, "Oh, if you know Chinese, you can like get into the Chinese business community here. Maybe you can take a chunk of the like local economy." I don't know. They would just make fun of me, like saying, "Oh, the Chinese own everything here." So that started to get me to think about how Filipinos have these stereotypes about the Chinese and how there's this disconnect between relations and then the Chinese community in the Philippines. I'm actually wearing a barong right now. It's our traditional, it's our traditional clothing.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, Ethan. We have a few minutes left, and I have a couple of questions that are remaining from the people entered into the chat earlier, and a question that I think might apply to all of you, actually. This came up in various ways in some of your presentations. I think Mark was explaining that sort of this cultural and historical category isn't monolithic, but then there was a sort of an overcorrection, right, to try to that maybe almost obscured the identity of the group. And this came up with Irene's project as well. Irene was talking about how she wanted to tell individual stories, not necessarily to give generalizable broad statements about the category of people that she was writing about. And I wonder if any of you would like to add any sort of further thoughts about the challenge of writing about, putting people into a category, writing about them, categorically, but then not treating them, not being reductive about it, right? Not oversimplifying or being too broad or general in your discussion. If there were any particular challenges and that you wrestled with it in the process of working on your thesis to that end, could you share them with us?
I can share two really quickly. Here. First, I really wanted a quantitative approach to this kind of topic, just because I thought that there's a lot of qualitative work done that's done really well, and I wanted, I think, a larger approach. But what I found is, especially with legal status being a question, quantitative data was hard to both find for secondary sources. So analyzing kind of just large, more generalizable data was the best way to go. And I think that led to also, when researching or trying to understand a population that I'm not a part of, I think it was really important for me both to understand kind of best practices for the researcher / these students' perspective in that, but then also just trust, I think, both, like, I guess, the subjects themselves in terms of like what would be the best way to go about it. So speaking to scholars on undocumented students, as well as seeing past works done by it and what they did, I think was the best way for me to try to navigate, and like, how do I best represent this group and like not I guess patronize or try to minimize the nuances within them. I also think that a very qualitative study can go really in depth with those kind of nuances, while a larger, almost census kind of study, I think it's hard to fully represent it. But it's definitely a struggle, and one that definitely was worried about, hopefully trying not to misrepresent.
Thank you.
In McCombs, when we're doing segmenting of a market, we have this acronym LIDS. And it stands for large, identifiable, distinctive, stable. And then the last one, which doesn't do with the acronym, is actionable. And I think a lot of times, when we're doing this kind of large scale historiographical or political research, it helps to think about that as a way of divvying up groups so that you encapsulate the actual identities of the people who are within those groups, but have enough of the groups so that people are covered under this identity, but that the groups encapsulate all the people who are in the identity and none of the people who fall under a different identity. And I think there's kind of levels to that, where we should understand the covenanter movement as a whole under a certain habitus, and then we can divide segments up by different practices that came out of that habitus. So it really is a challenge, and it's an imperfect art, even in modern day business, when we have Gallup polls and a whole bunch of market research and polls that we can send out all the time. It's a lot harder to do, and even more of an art when you have to look back a couple hundred years and try and like flesh out who people were and what they actually believed and how they actually acted.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to this topic as well. It's something that I don't have a firm answer for, and that I still feel like I'm thinking about it more deeply even right now than I was maybe earlier on in my thesis writing process. But so I talked a little bit about the theme of racial melancholia that that came up in some research. So there was this like little excerpt from the research where they were talking about a patient that this therapist had. The research is done by a therapist. The therapist talks about this patient she has named Elaine, whose parents immigrated from Vietnam, and she lives her whole life knowing that her mom gave up so much to come from Vietnam to here, gave up so much of her hopes. And so she has this persisting sense of unease that she's not fulfilling, she's not living up to what her parents sacrificed, and this narrative that goes on. And so the psychologist talks about how this narrative is like so common for children of immigrants. But in some ways, you don't even know if it's true or if it's just a narrative. You know what I mean? Like, did she really sacrifice? Is sacrifice just the way that we used to describe, what happened in order to create a story that makes sense to us? So I think that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about, even when I'm talking about eldest born daughters, like carrying burdens, like, what does that really mean? Or like, is that just a story that we're telling? Like, how do I make sure that I'm not getting stuck to one narrative or one way of thinking? So I just really liked this note about what are the stories we tell ourselves and how do they cause us harm? And yeah, I don't know, like I'm just things I'm thinking about. I have no definitive answer.
I'll add something really quick here.
Yeah.
One thing I commonly found in my research was writers saying, you know, we're not saying that all Chinese Filipinos are rich and own like massive businesses, but we're dealing with why do Filipinos have this perception? And it tends to be because the Chinese find themselves in very public, I suppose, or publicized or visible industries like retail or trade and things like that. So when I say like the Chinese Filipinos all are wealthy, that's obviously not true. But my thesis was trying to figure out why that attitude exists. And
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. There was a question that Angela asked earlier during Jay's presentation that we didn't have a chance to address. She asked, did you look at what Texas schools are doing now that may or may not be supportive? Are there examples of school policies or practices that you think would be more successful?
In looking at Texas in particular, I think the best practices I found were at the post-secondary level. In the secondary level, like high schools, we've currently kind of cut funding for English language learner programs, but at the post-secondary ones, Texas in 2001 passed in-state tuition for undocumented students as long as they resided here for a certain period of time. And since then, we found larger increases in college enrollment, particularly among older male students. So I think it's interesting just because people may perceive Texas to have anti-immigrant sentiments or may be a state that isn't receptive, but the business community here was as well as the immigrant coalition were both big advocates for in-state tuition policies and also have been protective of these kind of students for varying reasons. But I think right now Texas is a model for other states that have since then passed in-state tuition for post-secondary education for these undocumented students.
Okay, thank you. This will be the last question because we need to clear the room in time for the next session to begin. I think that all of you have addressed sort of your personal stake in these thesis projects that has come up during the Q&A, except I don't think that question was posed yet to Mark. So Mark, can you tell us about what it was that on a personal level drew you to this project?
Well, I go to a Presbyterian church, so that's part of it.
Mhm.
But I think more than that, more than any personal connection, I just thought that this was the most effective way of manifesting, my interest in law and politics and the foundations of American political thought, and at the same time finding a way to analyze the frameworks under which people make decisions. And I like getting inside the reasoning of people to find out what makes them tick and why they act the way they do. And I thought this topic was a really good balance of figuring out the motivations of people and the processes they use to make decisions, while at the same time fulfilling that interest in law and politics by finding these ideological roots of the system that we all live under.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for your excellent presentations, and thanks as well to those who came and listened and were supportive and posed questions for you. Congratulations, and hopefully you will go and attend some other sessions and lend your support and attentiveness to those as well. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Dr. Valentine.